her, and thank you, Kelsey. This meeting is being recorded. So we have Dr. Suzanne Soderberg joining us all the way from Queen's University in Ontario, and we're really excited to have her here today to share her expertise and knowledge with us. She is a professor jointly appointed to the Department of Political Studies and the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Soderberg has earned her doctorate from Johann Wolfgang Goethe Frankfurt University in Germany. Prior to her appointment at Queen's in 2004, Professor Soderberg held a tenured track appointment in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta. Dr. Soderberg has been awarded the prestigious Jane and Atos Erco Visiting Professorship in Studies of Contemporary Society at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies, where she's undertaking research on linkages between low-income housing, finance, and social reproduction in Berlin and Dublin. She is author of Debt Fair States and the Poverty Industry, just published in 2014, and she's just published a book titled Urban Displacements, Governing Surplus and Survival in Global Capitalism. So we're really excited to have her with us today. Last week, we talked a little bit about neoliberalism, or a few weeks ago, we talked about neoliberalism, and last week we talked about mutual aid. And so we're really excited to kind of continue these important discussions on the way that this pandemic is really elevating issues that were here before the start of the pandemic. And so one of those is the housing crisis. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Soderberg. I think you're muted.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you for letting me know that I was muted as well. I'm going to share some slides with you. And I didn't know that my co-speaker was not going to show up, so I really cut my slides down. I have about half an hour, maybe 35 minutes if I don't speak super quickly. But I would really love to engage with you on this topic and find out a lot more of what's going on in Chicago and your own experiences with housing, because that would be super interesting to have a dialogue, because as you can tell from the title, the housing crisis is not just something that happens in a particular, urban setting or suburban setting or rural setting, but it's global, right? There are differences, of course, across geographies, but it essentially is a global phenomenon, which makes it incredibly scary at the same time as well. So I just want to start off my talk by stating that the main objective is to build off the assigned reading, The Permanent Crisis. If you haven't done the reading, that's okay. You can still follow along. But I just want to echo the point, in case you haven't undertaken the reading, the following point that the reading tries to make. And their big takeaway, or one of the big takeaways, is that the global housing crisis is neither a novel nor a temporary phenomenon. Look, this has been around for decades, right? And one of the problems with designating it as a crisis seems to suggest that it's temporary, right? Or that it's a recent phenomena. And yes, the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, or the Great Financial Crisis, which was brought about by real estate speculation, housing, did augment and create a lot of distress after that particular crisis. And we know from the pandemic that housing crisis, as people have lost their jobs, as people have been evicted from their rental housing, or their homes have been repossessed, that many of them find their way into homelessness, right? And we see a picture here, which is not uncommon across the entire globe, of tent cities within urban centers. Even in a small university town where I live, we had a tent city set up in April as shelters where, adhering to social distancing and budgets were cut, et cetera, et cetera. So what I really want to say here is this crisis is probably not a good way to call it a crisis, because a crisis seems to suggest it's temporary, there's rupture and change, but we haven't seen that, right? I would like to argue today that instead, the dominant technical and market-based framing of the housing crisis, particularly its solution, which, and I'll discuss this later, as housing for all, serves to erase the power and the politics undergirding the production and the reproduction of what I refer to in the book, and we can talk about here, as displaced survival. This is a normalized everyday life of housing insecurity, of structural violence that people face, right, through over-indebtedness, then evictions, and then eventually homelessness. And I know all of you are interested in the health components of that. And, there's a lot of grave implications of mental and physical health in this I would call it, yes, a normalized daily life of displaced survival, right? So that said, what I want to do in the next half an hour or so is just go over these following points so we can start engaging critically with the housing crisis and its attempt to erase the politics and power underpinning its its solution. So I just want to quickly open with, what is the dominant narrative of what the housing crisis is, right? And we'll see that's a very technical, packaging of it, and where, which tenure this falls, housing crisis is really articulated in, and why, according to the dominant viewpoint, housing crisis has emerged. From there, we'll be able to understand the solutions that are given to governments, national governments, municipal governments, in terms of dealing with the housing crisis, which is housing for all. And I'll unpack, some of the three policy prongs that are underpinning housing for all. And for those of you that have been studying neoliberalism, this should not come as a surprise to you. Then I want to look at housing for all in practice. How does this rhetoric of housing for all translate on the ground, right, in reality? And as you know, a lot of you that are practitioners, that a lot of times the policy talk doesn't actually, jive with the walk of what's really going on. And so in order to sort of fulfill this particular section, I'm going to draw on the cases of Berlin and Dublin, just to show you some of the, I'm hoping, a lot of similarities that are happening also in Chicago in the United States, because they are happening here in Canada as well. And then I want to close by just being kind of controversial and throwing out points that I hope that we can discuss and try to push us beyond the housing crisis narrative. Okay, if I'm going too quickly, just let me know and I will slow down. So what's the housing crisis? Essentially, according to the dominant narrative that I'm sure all of you have encountered, there is an imbalance between housing demand and housing supply, right? Again, a technical economic framing of the problem, a historical lack of politics, right? There is a dire need for adequate and affordable housing, and that is not met by housing supply. Okay, so that's the housing crisis in a nutshell. So where is it happening in terms of the different types of housing? Most of the housing crisis that's happening right now in terms of evictions and homelessness that follow evictions most of the time is in the rental housing sector. And this is a dominant tenure in which the world's urban poor, not just in the global north, not just in Europe and North America, but also in Latin America and Southeast Asia and large parts of African cities where the urban poor reside. They reside in landlord-tenant relationships, right? They don't own their own homes. And this is the tenure from which they are frequently displaced through evictions. I should also note, for those of you that don't know this, that rental housing has two components. There's public or social housing, and there's private rental housing. Now, over the last couple of decades, you probably know that social housing has dwindled in terms of number and quality due to neoliberal restructuring. And the preference for policymakers aligning with this housing for all solution is very much so home ownership or living and residing within the rental housing sector. I should also note that while home ownership is the dominant tenure within North America, still the dominant tenure within North America and Europe, there has been a steep rise in terms of the rental sector. And that's because people are priced out of home ownership and they're priced out of home ownership. And we have a reality now where the dominant sector, especially for young people or people with low incomes, are living in rental housing. Okay, so it's a big tenure for those for low income, low wage workers, but also for middle class individuals. So here's the rub. Why is the housing crisis occurring? So the biggest voice in terms of explaining why the underlying cause of the housing crisis is, unsurprisingly, organizations like the World Bank, UN Habitat, and reflecting, of course, dominant national governments like the United States, European governments, a position on the reading of the underlying cause of crisis. And here is a quintessential explanation of why the housing crisis has emerged. And this came out in a flagship document by the World Bank entitled, and you can see here by the reference, Housing Enabling Markets to Work. And this was a big shift in the way that housing was managed, right? When they realized there's this imbalance between housing supply and housing demand, the neoliberals got to work and said, well, of course, within our framework, it's the governments, it's policies that are to blame, not markets, right? So here is, like I said, this quintessential reading of the cause of the housing crisis, which is poor or incorrect policy choices on the part of governments, which serve to constrain market efficiency and the responsiveness of market actors, right? Business interests, for example. And this results in reduced private investment, unaffordable and lower quality housing, all of which negatively affect the poor. And here we can pull out, this assumption that's just laid at our feet as a natural, right? It's not even given as an assumption; it's just given as as a truth, right? Which is that private market actors are more efficient, rational, right, and innovative than governments could possibly be. Right? So they should actually take the lead in resolving that imbalance between housing demand and housing supply. So from that reading of the cause of crisis, we have a particular solution that's given to us. And the dominant solution from the 1990s to present time is wrapped around this housing for all narrative. And this is how prevalent this narrative is. The United Nations, as you probably know, forged the Sustainable Development Goals, which were to last from 2015 to 2030. Within these Sustainable Development Goals, we find housing for all. Sustainable Development Goal 11 states that the aim is by 2030 that all governments should ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services, both in advanced industrial countries and developing countries. And that's one of the key differences, just as a footnote, with these Sustainable Development Goals. They apply both to the so-called Global South, the developing countries, as well as the Global North. So the solution, the dominant solution, housing for all, is essentially a strategy promoted by by very powerful international organizations and governments in the Global North and the Global South to meet the growing demand for affordable dwellings through market mechanisms, right? And I'm going to suggest that there's three correct, right, going back to that World Bank quote earlier, there's three correct policies that should be implemented by governments in order to make sure that there's this balance between supply and demand of housing. And the first is the privatization of social housing. The second is to facilitate financialization. And the third is to implement austerity urbanism. Now, in what follows, I'm going to look at each three in turn so that it makes sense to you. So privatization is within the housing for all paradigm is essentially that states should withdraw from managing the housing sector by selling off public or social housing, right? Lifting rental caps. Anything that's constraining market activity should be removed. States should instead incentivize private market actors by long-term land leases. I don't know if you know this, but one of the most expensive component in building housing is land. So the narrative here is that, municipal governments like the city of Chicago own land. They still probably own a lot of land, and they should lease this land or even give it to donate it to the private sector so that they can build affordable housing on this land. Okay, states can incentivize private markets by offering low interest rates or tax breaks. And it is assumed that these proper policy choices will allow private market actors to fill the housing need in an efficient and innovative manner. The second policy prong of housing for all is financialization. And essentially, this means a structural transformation of states and economies, such as households and businesses, through the growing dominance of financial actors, financial markets, and investment practices. How is this achieved? In housing, this is achieved through privatization that we just discussed, through deregulating any type of constraints that fall upon financial actors or markets and investment practices, right? Lift all those regulations, which they have been doing, especially in the United States, with a lot of fervor since the 1990s. And the other is what I call debt fair, obviously from a book I wrote in 2014. And actually one of the key countries that I focus on is the United States in this book. And debt fair essentially is an attempt, or it describes policies and regulations and rhetoric used by states to normalize and facilitate the dependence of the working poor on expensive consumer credit, like student loans, like payday loans, like credit cards, in order to augment and or replace their living wages and or their social wages. Okay, so that's one way that we can get the households financialized into the system as well. And one of the key players, though, in terms of housing is these institutional investors that have taken over the sort of rental landscape, if you will. And the biggest of all players are these so-called real estate investment trusts, or REITs, or REITs, or REITs, however you want to call them. Everyone has a different way of pronouncing it. I think in the US, you call them REITs. And REITs in the US, for example, wield around $2 trillion in assets. That represents around 500,000 residential properties. They're also known as financialized landlords. They're not your typical amateur mom and pop landlords, right, that are buying another building or a house as investment. These are huge, mammoth corporations. And they're so big, I'm actually going to give you a little bit more information on them. They're publicly traded companies, right? They're like any, like Apple, like Microsoft, right? Whose principal activity is the ownership and management of income producing real estate, like rental buildings, student residences, et cetera. Whatever they can get their hands on that can make money, they're there. And they're big, and they're transnational, and they're incredibly powerful. And their aim is, like all other corporations, to increase shareholder value, right? So again, we have this schism between, and in the article they talked about, real estate versus home. Here, definitely we have, the balance towards looking at housing as real estate, not as a home, right? So the third prong of Housing for All policy prong is austerity urbanism. And we've all heard about austerity, especially after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. But this is a new round of spending cuts geared towards municipal governments. Okay, so we've cut the national governments to the bone, but now it's time, and the state governments now time to reach down and get municipal governments to really cut back on their social spending. And one of the ways that this really hurts, especially the urban poor, is that municipal governments through the 1990s have become more responsible for housing, right? So this is a huge whammy for municipal governments, this sort of austerity urbanism, like get your books in order, make sure everything is balanced, because that's really important, and that will help us achieve that balance between housing demand and housing supply. And how this is done is by outsourcing public services to the private sector. And I'm going to be discussing this later in the case of Dublin, how homeless shelters are very so marketized, right? And I think this is, from what I've seen on Google, this is a big thing in the United States as well, which I was surprised to see. But what's the logic behind this? Look, austerity urbanism is important because it will ensure that city governments' reliance on market mechanisms to resolve social problems, such as the lack of sufficient supply of affordable housing, is seen as more efficient and will result in a win-win scenario, right? If they do this, if they balance their books, if they rely on the market, the efficient, rational, innovative market, it's going to be a win-win for the urban poor. They're going to get that investment. They're going to get the houses built on their public land. Everything will be good, right? So essentially, those are the three. I mean, there's many more, but those are the three prongs of the housing for all, the policy prongs of housing for all, and their underlying assumptions, if you will, right? So now I want to look at how those three policy prongs play themselves out, go over the Atlantic and hit the European Union to see how they play themselves out on that continent. And I'm looking at Berlin and Dublin for various reasons. I look at Berlin because it is the capital city of the most powerful and wealthiest country within the European Union and indeed the world, Germany. Berlin is also paradoxically known as the homeless capital of Germany. Dublin is an interesting case because it was front and center of the 2007-2008 housing crisis, which hit more sort of home ownership, people that were holding mortgages. Since then, it's bounced back and it has registered some of the highest growth rates in the European Union. It also has the highest level of rental rates within the European Union. It's right up there with London and Paris. And at the same time, it's experiencing a homelessness crisis, a huge homelessness crisis. So for those two reasons, I'm looking at these two cities. But again, you'll see a lot of similarities running through each of these illustrations. So let's look at Berlin right now. How does housing for all play out in Berlin? And I'm going to start with this picture. And this picture is of the Bankgesellschaft Berlin, or BGB, and it is essentially at that time the largest savings bank in Berlin, in the city. And it played a really, really important role for the Berlin government, who owned about 56% of the shares in this bank. In the 1990s, you probably know Germany and Berlin were undergoing reunification. So the Berlin government was spending a lot in terms of ensuring that infrastructure was running well between Eastern and Western Berlin. At the same time as they were running up huge expenses with the infrastructure and reunification, the federal government of Germany was devolving housing responsibility to the municipal level. And in the 1990s, many national governments were doing this. Okay, so what happens in 2001 is that this bank goes bankrupt because it was investing in shady real estate deals. And in fact, this resulted, and a lot of people didn't know this, but this resulted in the largest financial crisis in Germany in the post-World War II period. And that was before 2007, 2008. Another crisis, financial crisis brought about by real estate speculation. But at this time in 2001, this crisis was so intense that the weekly newspaper Der Spiegel was cited as stating that this type of crisis would cause social conflicts on an undreamt of scale. And they were correct. Under the austerity urbanism paradigm, which came to Germany and Berlin quite early, the federal government decided they were not going to bail out Berlin at all. They had to get themselves out of this mess. Well, the city of Berlin's already reeling from massive debt through reunification spending and trying to keep its responsibilities of housing afloat. So it's in a pickle, to say the least. How does it get itself out of a pickle? It sells 13 of its 19 municipal housing companies, which were these huge public housing units, right, that had rent control, etc. 13 out of 19. And we'll show a slide in a moment of who actually bought all these municipal housing companies. But the remaining 6 municipal housing companies were also subject to, neoliberal logic as well. They had to embrace the entrepreneurial spirit and to make sure, in the spirit of austerity urbanism, that their books were their numbers were in the black, so to speak, right? That they weren't running any debt because the city couldn't afford any more payouts to these corporations, these municipal housing corporations. So they were run like businesses. They increased their rents dramatically. Even to this day, only a few years ago, there were examples where living in a municipal housing company, sometimes you were paying higher rent than if you were living in a private rental unit, right? So they meant business when they said turn these into businesses, entrepreneurial, and embrace the entrepreneurial spirit. And I should also note at this time we also have higher rates of unemployment. Berlin is like a lot of big cities, is service sector oriented, which means yes, these lovely, well-paying, high-tech jobs, but also low-wage, low-skilled jobs that are incredibly precarious, right? Gig economy workers, for example. So I just want to have a slide here to show you two REITs, the real estate investment trusts in Germany, that bought up the majority of those municipal housing companies from the Berlin government. And Deutsche Wohnen, down the second, sort of the bottom box, is now the largest landlord in the city of 3.5 million people. We have a situation in Germany, and this is taken only a few years ago, where advertising one flat, one affordable flat, will bring these types of just crowds of people applying for one flat. It's crazy, right? So the housing for all so far on the ground has not worked in Germany, despite the fact that they have embraced all the three policy prongs. So what you have is an annual growth rate right now in Berlin of about 40,000 per annum. You have rental increases that annually average 9.4% over the last several years. The highest was registered in 2020, and that was the highest globally, right? So we have seriously high rental increases in this city. There's growing competition and discrimination for flats, right? There's racial discrimination, gender discrimination, all kinds of discrimination happening. There's massive competition between, students coming in and other people that have lived there all their lives, right? Creating all kinds of fragmentation amongst the population. And as everywhere, poor households are paying a higher proportion of their monthly income for rent, right? Which is 40%. And, that may not sound crazy because I'm sure in Chicago, that's probably even higher. But this is a country, again, and a city with a relatively generous welfare system, right? So that's pretty high for that type of context. Okay, so we're back to this building again. This is the BGB building. Do you remember it went kapow in 2001? We're now fast forwarding 2015. 2015 has a new role because it's no longer a bank. It has now taken on the role, if you don't read German, which probably most of you don't, it is essentially the Ministry for Refugee Affairs. And why is it the Ministry of Refugee Affairs in 2015? Well, in 2015, the city of Berlin received the highest amount of refugees in any other city in Europe. Remember the refugee crisis? So in 2015, the city of Berlin welcomed 55,000 refugees. That number went slightly down in 2016 and then slightly down even more in 2017, but 55,000 refugees that are entering a city that doesn't have adequate affordable doesn't have a sufficient number of adequate or affordable rental flats. Crazy. There's three options these refugees have. They can stay in emergency shelters, and I'm sure you guys have seen pictures of gymnasiums with these makeshift beds where families who've already suffered so much traumatic stress are now forced to live for a very long time. They can try the rental housing market, which they have no success in. Very, very few access the rental housing because of language barriers, discrimination, lack of funds, etc. And the other option available to them are in line with Housing for All, which is a privatized mechanism for temporary housing. And that is communal dwelling, set up kind of like student residences, or these bright ideas that the government came up with, which are container villages. And as you can see, these are little container homes, right? I took this picture a couple of years ago. It was 38.5 Celsius at that time. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. All I know it was bloody hot. It was so hot. And, there was no sign of life except a security guard and this little girl on her bike. But there's no ventilation at all in these places. And I spoke to the district welfare office that was responsible for this particular container village. And they said, they constantly get calls, especially in the winter, of little kids burning their hands on pipes because there's no safety standards involved in this. There's no oversight in terms of security and health of these particular, they're containers, right? They're what you put in the back of the trucks, essentially, with a little window in it. And I just FYI, since I have a little bit of time here, when I was speaking to the Ministry of Refugee Affairs, the person that was in charge of contracting these containers, they said, the first lot cost the city umpteen so much money, and they were just so terrible, they had to send them back. Private market at work with its efficiency and innovation. And this, I suppose, is a lot better. But when you actually talk to the welfare officers, they for sure are not saying that they're better. They're called out on a regular basis and not waste, but they were complaining because they're grumpy, but they use the term waste a lot of time going out there and dealing with the accidents, dealing with all kinds of issues with these particular units. Housing, right? So that is the Housing for All solution in Berlin. And I just want to end, I took the slide out, but recently the Minister of Social Justice, or Social Affairs Minister, suggested that one way of going forward with their housing crisis is to purchase hundreds of tents and put the homeless in these tents, but make sure that the tents were put, supervised, and that they were placed in places in the city that were not controversial, that they were managed tent cities. So this is where we're at right now in terms of solutions in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, capital city. So that said, let's go over to Dublin and see what's going on there. But before we do that, I just want to mention two things. Well, one thing is that homelessness sometimes, it's complex, and we can talk about that later. And there's various definitions, and they're all contested. But there's two aspects, I would say, of homelessness, two major aspects. And one is obviously the more visible, rough sleeping, on the street with tents, homelessness. But the majority of homelessness, at least in Dublin and Berlin, occurred was less visible, right? So overcrowding, families living with friends, families living with family members, right, and living in one room, and an entire family. Overcrowdedness, the other sort of expression of overcrowded living, invisible homelessness, are families living in hotels, which I didn't know that this is happening in the United States as well, as an option to house the homeless. But it definitely is a prevalent alternative it's a prevalent strategy used in Dublin, used in Berlin to house homeless families. So let's look at what's going on in terms of housing for all in Dublin. So the Dublin government aggressively starts privatizing social housing, and get this, during a major economic growth period. A major economic growth period. I don't know if you've heard of the Celtic Tiger. It was like the world was applauding. The IMF was so happy for Ireland because it was following its structural adjustment policies. And there was massive growth from 1995 to 2007. Now, we realized that a lot of that growth was based on financial speculation in the rental house or in home ownership and mortgages. But we'll get to that in a second. The point is that even during times of economic growth, they are privatizing social housing. This is how these governments are adhering so strongly to the Housing for All paradigm. So from 2008, so that's right after the financial crisis, right, where austerity urbanism hits, from 2008 to 2018, under the ambit of austerity, the government cuts housing even more. 72% of social housing spending was cut. And I have Iris Reet in here, or Wright, or however you want to pronounce the Real Estate Investment Trust. They become the largest private landlord in Dublin. at this time. So there's financialization for you. And in Dublin, it's quite unique because the social housing is effectively the private rental sector. There's so little social housing that people that are placed on the waiting list that wish to access social housing are basically given a stipend to then live in the private rental sector. That's the way things work in Dublin. This is housing for all in practice. So from 2016 to 2018, we have house prices rising by 13%. No one can really afford to live in a house except the really wealthy people. So everyone's in rental units. Average rent in Dublin skyrockets by 60% between 2011 and 2008. Unsurprisingly, homeless accommodation also skyrockets by 180% under the Housing for All model. So Ireland essentially now has another housing crisis. The first crisis was when, they were speculating on real estate, on mortgages, on home ownership. This time they have a housing crisis in their rental sector. They have over 90% of low-income households, many with children, are on the wait list for social housing, often for years. Many of these, and they're on the wait list, and many of them are homeless, and many of them are first-time homeless families. And that's another interesting trend I've seen in Berlin. My other case study was also in Vienna, and Dublin was a new demographic of homeless individuals, which we're seeing in Canada as well, in Toronto, for example. So these people, essentially, let's get the irony here. These first-time homeless families have been displaced from the private rental sector due to insufficient income, right? They're entering into, they have rental debt or rental arrears, and that's why they get evicted. That's the primary reason why they're getting evicted, according to the city of Dublin. So they're on the wait list to get rehoused in the same type of housing from which they were expulsed in the first place. This is the way housing for all works in many cities. So just to wrap up Dublin then, the solution to their problem of the housing crisis is that they have housed these people on the wait list, these homeless families on the wait list, in hotels and hostels. And, because it's the more efficient way to do it, because it's the private sector, we also have some nice bills that are tied to this. So in 2019, and these prices have just skyrocketed, like from 2011 to 2019, these every year, there's a massive increase in the amount of money the city of Dublin spends on accommodating the homeless within these hotels and hostels. So in 2019, this is according to the city of Dublin statistics, they spent 19% more on their budget to house homeless families in hotels and hostels than they did in 2018. They spent in 2019 an average, exactly 170 million euros. That is, and I did the math, that is 205 million US dollars. In fact, your dollar has fallen to the euro. Too bad you can't travel. It'd be a good time for the Europeans to come over to the US. So it gets better than this, though, because there's like massive cash cow hotels that are involved in this. So one hotel in 2019 was paid 4.8 million US dollars, just one hotel, right? There were others, and 19 other hotels received something like 1 million euros, something like 1.2 million US dollars to house homeless families in Dublin. Now, again, within the Housing for All remit, the city of Dublin said, look, this is getting a little out of hand. Let's have a solution here. And our solution won't be to build affordable housing, no, because we have to let the markets do that. But what we can do is create about 22 family hubs. And these family hubs are essentially communal dwellings where families live in a room, like in a hotel, except they don't have to move around a lot. And they can share a kitchen, because normally they can't cook in hotels or hostels, right? They can share a kitchen and living space. A lot of these hubs are not publicly run, they're privately run. And in fact, some of the hubs are in refurbished hotels and hostels. So it's turned into a profit-making site, right, in many ways. And we could talk about that later. They're very controversial. They're not obviously ideal living conditions for families who stay there for years, right? And live in this displaced survival for years. So the second solution offered by the city of Dublin is to rehouse, as I mentioned, homeless families in the private rental market. But a new way that they're doing this is by offering the Housing Assistance Program. And this Housing Assistance Program, or HAP, is different from previous assistance programs in that they are compelling the homeless families to locate a private rental unit on their own. So they're individualizing the responsibility to the homeless families, right? So they have to find their own flat in the private rental sector. Then the government, when they have found a flat and they've done all the paperwork, the government will then pay the landlord directly. The problem with this, there's many problems, but two problems with this is that you're a family and you're in there competing with all these people that are looking for an affordable flat. Discrimination is going to be front and center when you tell them that you're going to be paying your rent through HAP, right? And the second related problem is that rents in Ireland and in Dublin have increased 36% of the height of during the Celtic Tiger, when the place was booming and rents were already crazy. They're now 36% above those levels, right? The city of Dublin can't keep up, right? So the money that they're issuing for HAP is less than what, of course, the private rental market is asking for rent. So HAP's not really doing a good job. But as soon as people start looking or agreeing to use HAP, they're automatically off the wait list, which makes that look nice, right? The number is going down on the wait list, but yet they're still living in hotels and they're still, homeless essentially. Okay, so the final section is, I'm hoping this would be a good way to sort of frame our discussion. And as I mentioned at the beginning, like we need to push beyond the housing crisis. There's more to the housing crisis than the housing crisis, right? And, the housing for all, which is at the center of the housing crisis, I've hoped that like this iceberg, we've seen a little bit more to what's underneath the sort of housing for all, the contradictions, the power, the politics. And the promise of the housing for all, which we've been given for over 20 years, is that correct market-based policies will create an equilibrium between housing demand and housing supply. But as we've seen in the Berlin case and the Dublin case, the reality is that there's increased displacements amongst the urban poor, and these have increased over the past several decades, and they're heightened with every crisis, including COVID-19. Housing for all strategy discourages states. There's no space for states to invest public funds directly into housing. Construct and manage social housing. There's no space for that. It's completely off the table because it's seen as a waste of money, because governments are not as innovative and rational and efficient as the private sector is, right? Nonprofit community-based alternatives, collective alternatives are off the table because they're, again, what if they don't work? The state would actually have to, support this initiative. And we can't use our money for this. Let the private sector take the lead in this, right? Or at the very least, let's have a public-private partnership. And another way that Housing for All discourages other alternatives is the regulation of the private sector actors, like the REITs or the REITs, right? And other financial landlords. And, typically, REITs, for example, are not subject to be taxed on their rental income, right? As an incentive for allowing them to operate and provide housing for all, right? And also importantly, thinking about moving beyond. I had another slide, and I'll just, because we've got time, I'll just note one thing about the housing for all as well. It silences the gendered, the class, and the racial dimensions that underpin displacements, and that are very clear in Berlin, very clear in Vienna, very clear in Dublin, and I'm sure very clear in Chicago and elsewhere as well. So it's time to go beyond the housing crisis and, think of several decades of crisis. Perhaps we need to call it something else, or at least think about it as something else. As I mentioned, crisis is not just about rupture and change. Other social theorists have also suggested that crisis is also a time of implementing rationality and order in a society. Housing for All may have facilitated this new rationality and order. And I think it's time that we need to interrogate the politics and power involved in producing and reproducing complex processes of displacement that are entangled in the housing crisis and housing for all. And importantly, that displacements are very much so that involve over-indebtedness, evictions, and homelessness, this vicious cycle that people live in every day of their lives. Incredibly, and more and more people, this has become their new normal. The structural violence of debt, of evictions, and homelessness has become an everyday way of living for an entire like these kids living in hotels. They know nothing else except this, right? And I think it's important to also move beyond the housing crisis and its dominant solution of housing for all, to really sort of ask and question and challenge who's benefiting from this reality that's been established for the last 20 odd years. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. I've just got, if you have questions later, email and Twitter. And I just want to note that debt fair book where I talk about the United States and consumer debt has now been open access for the last week or so. So I'm really happy about that. So if you just type it in and go to the Routledge, you'll be able to get the entire book for free. It'll be PDF, but it'll be free nonetheless. And if you want to read more about the case studies, the Urban Displacement book, as Alexis mentioned, was just published a couple of months ago. So yeah, that's it for me now. I will allow you guys to start talking and ask questions or debate or I don't know, do whatever you do after this.
Thank you so much. This was so insightful, and I really appreciate kind of the global scope, because I think for folks that have been here the past couple of weeks, we keep talking a lot about these overlapping issues that we don't only see in Chicago or in the United States, that's global. So this has been really great and insightful. If folks have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And I also have some questions folks have already kind of sent me, and some students were asking on our discussion board this week. And I guess first is a couple questions about specific populations. So thinking about like in the context of refugees or immigrants on a global level, what would a solution look like?
Oh, just that? I can answer that in 1 minute.
That's the start. That's the first question.
I mean, look, that previous slide that I had, what housing for all, this dominant solution, what it silences, right? Is in those silences are really, solutions that have been there, right? Like social/public housing, taxing these rights. I mean, they don't get taxed on like rental income. That's crazy, right? Start taxing that, right? I mean, the states have helped them out a bit. Once they make their like $1 trillion, I think it's time to share the wealth a little bit here, right? And destigmatize social housing. I have a chapter on Vienna, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Viennese social housing units, but they have something like 220,000 social housing units that are beautiful. They're maintained. They're just stunning. They've been around like for hundreds of years, and there's no stigma to them, right? People live in social housing. Big deal, right? That's great. I have more money to spend on other things that capitalists like us to spend money on, right? Like other consumption items and just enjoy life, right? And that's an actual model that exists. Now, in the chapter, I do critique it, and this brings in the refugees, that it's exclusionary on racial lines, right? So newcomers that were not Austrian could not access the social housing, and they only lifted this in 2004. Can you believe that? But even after they've lifted it, there is still barriers to these social housing units because they're only offered to a certain income level, right? So a middle class income earner only can access these social housing units. for example, right? So there is, even in this lovely scenario of social housing in Vienna, which everyone praises as a prototype model, there are aspects of discrimination, right? And racial discrimination built into class and racial discrimination. So we have to be careful of these alternatives. Social housing and public housing is, I think, a definite way to go. Do not stigmatize it, and definitely make sure that it is, these barriers are not in the way. I mean, any kind of barrier in terms of people accessing this type of housing. But these type of housing can only be built if the states have money. And you know what? Let's get real. They always have money. They have money for their prisons and their police and everything. They have money for this, but they don't have money for basic, as you guys know, health services, social services. They never have money for that, right? I think it's time to push them to have money and prioritize these things. I mean, people need homes, right? We need healthy populations. We need, like, it doesn't make sense. These hotels, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I want to write a paper that actually does this whole bookkeeping on how much governments spend on these hotel shelters, these marketized spaces of homelessness, and sort of run the figures of how much that would cost to actually put build a social housing unit. For example, I bet you it's probably cheaper to build social housing, right, than pay these hotels so much money to house these people. There's no mental health or social services tied to this, right? They're in these private sectors, right? So it's got to be even more expensive then to send people out to make sure that these people are on the right track, et cetera, that they get the support they need, blah, 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 right? It just becomes more expensive in the end, not just to house them, but to keep them healthy, if that's even a priority, if that makes sense, right? So yeah, I mean, there's I would say, taxation, like turn everything that the Housing for All is on its head. Markets are not rational. Markets are not efficient, because if they were, we wouldn't have to bail them out every bloody 10 years, right? I mean, the financial markets are always prone to crises. I mean, just in our little narrative, how many crises did we come, that completely, created social chaos and disruptions in these cities, right? Let's regulate these financial markets. At the very least, let's tax them and use that money to build social housing and healthy communities that have that are able to provide access to all kinds of people in our communities, right? Newcomers, people who've been there forever, elderly, right, et cetera. I don't know if that answered your question, but can I just say, with the refugees in Germany and in Vienna, the first response of these two, Berlin and Vienna, these two wealthy cities, was to just basically leave these refugees on the street. The first response in Berlin were citizens, were private citizens that got into vans, got the small children with the young mother and put them in the van, and then found a place, a friend, they could stay with a friend for, until they're done with their paperwork. These guys just slept on the streets while the Ministry for Refugee Affairs was closed during the weekend. If you arrived on a Friday night, forget it, you were out on the street till Monday. And even then, there were so many, 55,000 people, you weren't even going to get a number or help or put into emergency shelter for weeks, right? So there were people fainting. It was horrific, right? But the people that really picked up the slack were just people like us, right? That were sitting there volunteering their time, trying to get these people, proper accommodations while they waited to get their paperwork processed. So, harness that I don't understand, like, the states are so, our people don't want to help, they don't want us to spend money on the refugees. Yes, they do. There's so many Berliners that were sitting there donating so much of their time to help these people, while the government authorities and other really powerful NGOs were doing next to nothing, right? So there is a political and social will for change, right? And whenever these type of crises happen, people do collectively come together and try to resolve these issues. So why are we always inundated with these neoliberal models of telling us that, market-based individualized solutions are the best way to go, when they're not, right? Not for the majority of us anyways. anyway, I think, again, with that, the refugees in Berlin, the refugees in Vienna, they are now, a lot of the new homeless demographic in these cities are refugees, the refugees that came in 2015, because they can't access the private rental market, and there's very few social housing units that they can access because there's not enough of them. So they're living in these containers and makeshift houses. I'd say just build some social housing to house these people. It's not rocket science, right? Um, but, and I'll throw this out to the group, there's something more to it. It's not just about housing. It's about a way that we've decided to organize capitalism, right? Because when we think about it, it's not just tenants that are in these houses, they're workers. And they're not just any workers, they're workers that have become redundant to the interests of capital, right? They're what Marx used to call surplus populations, right? Um, and that's a difficult population to manage and can control, right? There's no political motive to extend public funds to give these particular workers that are not deemed important to the economy any type of uh, uh, shelter, if you will, right? Any type of accommodations, any type of safety in terms of housing. And the permanent housing crisis, talks about how during Engels, in the 19th century, how, this was going on back then as well, but it was the workers that mobilized collectively and that were important that were given housing. Same as in Vienna, the workers that were given these social housing, the turn of the century, were important industrial skilled workers. Other workers were not given housing in these social housing units, right? So it's also a hierarchicalization of who's important to whom in society, right? And I think, again, like moving away just from housing and trying to understand housing as part of a capitalist system is important as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely very helpful and ties into a lot of the themes we've been talking about this whole semester. So with that, you talked a little bit about the kind of like individual collective will, but what would it take to move the political will to recognize the solution, actually implement the solutions that uh, you think would make the lasting difference? And as a lot of folks have been kind of hinting to in the chat, we were talking a little bit before the session started about the news that came out today of uh, the millions of dollars that the city of Chicago spent on the police instead of other services for the city. So what would it take for there to be movement for like our governments and our politicians to actually use the money that they do have in order to solve the problem rather than, you know, putting it towards these more expensive temporary solutions?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And I think it is very much so in the collective, right? I think the collective is always powerful. And these days, even, powerful unions are not that powerful anymore, right? But I think together, and okay, so you have to pick your battles and you have to be strategic and you have to think, okay, what can we do here? There's one initiative in Canada, it's called Generation Squeeze. And it's about, your generation that are really angry. You're going to be, future taxpayers, your taxpayers, future voter, or your voters, but you're going to be an important demographic in the United States. You are an important demographic, but a more important demographic to the politicians, right? And, it's pretty sad that, from that piece that that you had you guys read. I mean, here's a snippet from it. The housing or shelter poverty. There's no U.S. state where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford to rent or own a one-bedroom dwelling. That's crazy. Like, that is nuts. And people should be really, really angry and upset about that, right? And, if you mobilize around, what the politicians and what the general population can sort of, be empathetic to, which is, I want to have private property too. I want to have, around these sort of, I'm very skeptical of housing as a human right. I mean, I'm empathetic with the movement, but I'm also skeptical because the housing for all really really tries to embrace housing as a human right as part of its sort of rhetorical platform. But the point is that it's embraced housing as a human right because there's been a lot of groups on the ground that have pushed for this. It's been their mantra. And my skepticism of it is one thing, but a mantra like that has real power, right? And as long as people are cognizant of the fact that housing as a human right doesn't slip into the housing for all, the sort of neoliberal teeth of the housing for all, those three policy prongs I was talking about, that could be a very clear and concise sort of mantra to build a social movement around and say, we demand housing as a human right. We want you to recognize housing as homes again, not as real estate. I mean, do we really need these financialized landlords to like own the cityscape? I mean, this is not necessary, right? And they're not accountable to their tenants, right? So you can ride the whole accountability, right? We could democratize housing, right? Within that, I mean, does that make sense? Like, I think you need something that really, and housing as a human right really is. I mean, there are countless um, people and groups, all different sort of political persuasions and classes that are fighting for this, right? And I know in Europe it's a big movement. And in fact, they're even trying to, and the European Union, the government rhetorically is saying, okay, yeah, you're right. You know what? We need to go back to the model that the city of Vienna is proposing. And that's great. But remember that it's also very exclusionary, right? And class-based, and there's racial and class dimensions to that as well. But it's at least pushing the needle over. I mean, we're so far into neoliberalism, right? Like, you heard my story. It's like decades and decades of neoliberalism. And like, we're up to here in neoliberalism that many people don't even know we're in neoliberalism, right? So it'll take a lot of more engagement with the mainstream housing for all solutions, for example, to start chipping away at that very slowly in order then to tip it over, which may sound like a radical, like communist alternative, is really probably where we were maybe 40 years ago. Do you know what I mean? In terms of social housing, et cetera. So I think you have to start with what we have with the housing for all. And that's why I critiqued it. And then just kind of try to take it and run with it and say, yeah, you know what? You've promised housing for all and you haven't delivered. And push it on their own terms. And how do they explain it? No, you can't explain it by the market again, because this is what you're doing. We know all your assumptions and you keep saying this. So, and always, and I think, one of the things is to really fight power on its own terms and know. And that's why I'm so glad you guys are studying neoliberalism, because you can really start to disassemble and talk the talk of what these guys, and most of them are guys, are espousing to all of us and say, no, we know your logic and we have these stats here, it doesn't work. And that doesn't work. And that doesn't work. Doesn't work. And you just keep pushing them and pushing them with their own, words and their own numbers until something happens. And something will happen. And people are agitating a lot. I believe we have to believe that things will happen, but I don't think there's only one. I don't think there's one solution. Like, tell me what's going on in Chicago. I mean, there must be tons of. Chicago's known for its civic movements and political networks, et cetera. I mean, there must be a lot of solutions being floated in Chicago right now of what's going on. Is housing as a human right one of those mantras that people are getting behind and trying to push?
I would say it's definitely picking up, as well as raising the minimum wage. Not sure if that's a issue as well in Canada. And we do have our speakers for next week are going to focus a lot on Chicago local organizing. So we have two organizers as well as a scholar in gentrification. So if folks want to keep talking about this and specifically about Chicago, come next week as well.
I was also going to say, I know in a number of exchange groups I'm in, there are people doing co-housing or large co-housing projects. Like, they'll have a building and there's like one where it's like, oh yeah, we have this huge building and there's like 20 of us and we have this co-space. We have communal dinners and things like that. And it's really low rent, so it does allow people to save and kind of go. Also, there's people, who have roommates. That's a even bigger thing now. I don't, because because I don't like people touching my stuff. But a lot of people have roommates and the rent is really inexpensive. They're not trying to like make a profit. They're literally just trying to pay whatever fees they have to pay so that person can actually save up to move somewhere else. That's also a thing that's been happening too.
I think that's fabulous, right? I mean, you know, again, there's two sides to the coin. There's these social impact bonds that's really capture the imagination of the youth as well, right? As a way, and there's a lot of problems with that, but there's also possibilities with social impact bonds as maybe temporary measures to then get to, you know, purchase a nonprofit type of living space, a co-living space, right? That you can say, look, actually we can be in, we don't have to go into debt. We can actually be sustainable. We're not going to turn a profit, but we can be sustainable. Do you want to finance this, right? But I just want to say, you know, the state of displaced survival, one of the problems is that, and you know, I mean, anyone's faced with crushing student debt, right, or anything like that, it's insane how that just debilitates you, and you know, the disinterest, the you know, just mental fatigue. You're stressed all the time. I mean, you know, these are people, you know, that are living in displaced survival. They're living in you know, a two-bedroom apartment with like 10 family members. You know, they're like, oh my gosh, can you imagine? You know, a hotel, like people living in these hotels, they're going from one hotel room to another every 2 weeks, a different hotel room. There's these people find it really hard to mobilize. You know, to mobilize is, I think, a class thing too, right? It's the ability to have time and energy to network and think about ideas and come together as a collective and say, you know, we're going to change this, or let's just change that. That, I don't know. I mean, to me, I find that incredibly taxing for people themselves. Do you know what I mean? Those in the situation to mobilize. But I think it's important to invite them into any type of project that's happening as well, to be authors, right, of change. But you know, it doesn't have to be grand scale. It can be like, you know, the example here, it's just something small. Like if everyone did something small to change the world, there'd be big change, right? Um, and I think we have to also just rescale, even though, you know, I say the crisis is global in nature, but I think the solution's always going to be local.
So moving towards kind of our last couple minutes here, do you know if there's any international coalitions working towards housing for all, or housing as a human right?
Mhm.
Could you share any of that information?
Yeah, I mean, I have to, could I send it to you, or?
Sure, that works.
Top of my head, but definitely in Europe, there's a lot of networks that are moving towards housing for all. Um, you know, there's also, I don't know if you know of her. She used to be the former, she just stepped down, the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing Rights, Leilani Farah. And she, at the first slide that I showed you, Make the Shift, she's now the director of Make the Shift. And it's this huge global NGO that's really trying to push the human housing as a human rights initiative. And she's, you know, she's a good friend of mine. We've had lots of debates about it, but like at the end of the day, I see its limits, but I also see its potentials in terms of mobilizing vast amounts of interest to say, once again, to believe that housing should be considered a home, not primarily real estate, right? Um, and and I think she makes a really good case. And she's been all over the world, you know, talking to all kinds of groups. So, and she says that there is tons of solidarity within countries and between countries. I know the European Action Coalition on Housing Rights is big. And they've huge movement across cities in Europe, and they're the ones that have sort of helped bring the Vienna social housing model as an alternative that even the European Union is talking about, of going back to that. But something has to be done, because I think even without massive political pressure, it's just incredibly expensive to deal with homelessness, especially for municipalities that have to carry, right? They're the ones in most countries that are responsible for housing. And it's hard for them to carry that burden. And let's face it, guys, this isn't going to be the last crisis. It's not going to be the last pandemic, and it's not going to be the last, financial crisis that we saw in 2007, 2008. And in terms of refugees and migrants, this is going to be another major crisis that's happening, especially in the United States, which is a key, point of attraction for migrants, as is Germany. And this is going to put a lot of pressure, especially on cities like Chicago, and other cities in the United States. And, something's got to give. Right. I mean, I know you guys are like, well, there's a lot of homelessness and no one's ever doing anything about it. But I think everything has its tipping point, and it might be the tipping point for, municipal governments as well. I mean, hotels are expensive. Even if they're crappy hotels, they're pretty expensive, especially in a city like Chicago.
Yeah. With that, maybe our last question. A lot of times when we're talking about these big social movements for change, sometimes people say it could happen in a generation or 2 generations. How long do you think it would take for housing as a human right to be the dominant, approach?
I think that it's already happening. I mean, something that people are really embracing. I think that, people that are living on fixed incomes, from, senior citizens to students to, everyone that isn't making a gazillion, dollars a year, is really worried about the housing prices, right? Whether they're trying to get into the housing ladder, whether they're already in a home, but they're facing retirement and looking, oh my gosh, I can't even afford a retirement home. Even a smaller home is going to put me into debt, right? Everyone is facing this. And I think because it's so, pardon the pun, so close to home, it is something that people are very cognizant of, and I think very passionate about. But I think there's also this, especially in North America, I find this shame to sort of articulate, hey, I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair I can't pay rent, or I don't think it's fair that I can't afford a home, right? I mean, because the responsibility of individualization, that if you can't put a down payment on a house by the time you're at this age, then you're not successful, right? I mean, there's that sort of American dream that has become internalized with so many people. And by externalizing that and becoming very open with this, that I can't afford rent, I can hardly make ends meet by just paying rent. I mean, this is crazy. Why can't that, if that becomes sort of more of a discussion, and people are so afraid to talk about their monetary situations for some reason. I mean, there's this joke by an anthropologist years ago who said, I know more about my friends' sex lives than I do about how much money they have in the bank, right? That we become a little bit more relaxed with that and discuss this more openly, then I think that people would find a lot more resonance with other people to build a collective. Yeah, I'm in massive, I had massive student debt. I couldn't buy a house until I was in my 40s, right? And I'm glad I don't have to buy a house now, because I wouldn't be able to afford one here. There you have it, right? I mean, and if that becomes of a more sort of daily conversation, then that too can become normalized, and that we could, not normalized in the sense that we're numb to it, but that we're not ashamed to say, I have debt, I can't make it to the next paycheck, right? Even though I consider middle class, because everyone's considered middle class, right? And then people will, talk about this, and there'll be, can become an agenda, right? Like this generation squeeze, it's big, right? People are like, I can't start a family till I'm 50, because, they had this graph that to save up for median income at a certain age, it's wonderful with all these stats, but it would take something like 15 years for this particular couple to put a down payment on a house in Toronto. 15 years. Right? In the meantime, their rent's going through the roof because there's, no rent control. So it probably won't be 15 years, it'll probably be longer than 15 years. I mean, that should make people angry, right? And so their suggestion is, how the retirement, the Association of Retired People, I think the AARP in the United States, our version here, they said, we should create a collective like them, but for the younger generation around housing as a human right, in order then to push the government, right? And become a lobby group for, government. That's another way, right? Like that mainstream way of pushing government representatives. But you need a large number of people to do that. But I think that should be no problem, right? And I think, besides the housing crisis, it's a big crisis. It's called climate change, which is also tied to this, tied to your health concerns, et cetera. So I think, that's going to bring us all together anyways. I mean, I think that there's an underlying crisis right now that we will all be collectively, and we all are collectively pushing the government against. And once you have like this Green New Deal or these type of situations, housing is going to be front and center in something like that. It has to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. It flew by so quickly. So folks, feel free to drop your thanks in the chat. I want to remind folks, next week we have some community organizers who are local to Chicago to kind of build on a lot of these ideas. So feel free to join the session next week. The registration link will be sent out as it was this week. And if you really enjoy Epidemics of Injustice, we have a new donation page for the collaboratory, which is sponsoring the course. So we hope to be able to keep doing this course next year and bring our speakers to come in person when that's safe, and be able to do more events like this through the collaboratory. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Soderberg. It was great to have you. And
Thank you.
Now we will take a break for students who are registered in the class. We'll discuss our readings, and all folks who are not registered are welcome to hop off. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
So as always, this is being recorded, and this portion will only be posted to the Blackboard site, so feel free to turn on your cameras if you can or want to. I saw the discussion board is very lively this week, so I'm excited for our discussion. Before that, we're going to do a few housekeeping items. We're coming up on week 7 next week. So I just wanted to remind folks, keep on checking the discussion forum for different event options related to the outside activity. A few folks have already completed it, so feel free to keep adding things to that discussion forum, as well as checking it out to see if anything piques your interest. Also, if you haven't selected your book that you're reading for your midterm book report, also check out the forum. I think my sense is there's a majority who have picked out a book, but if you haven't yet, you can hop onto a group that's already there. If you can't decide, you can just do that. And if you have a book idea that isn't on the list, feel free to email I or Ms. Torres. And then another item is that we have posted the rubrics for both the midterm book report and the final assignment. So if you just want to take a look at that when you have a chance, if you have questions about the assignment, we tried to create the rubric that aligns with the specific things that we're looking for in the book report, as well as the final assignment. A lot of it is based on the information within it versus the typical like English book report of like grammar and length. We really want to see like the good content and the thought that you put behind your books, and how it applies to you, how it applies to the class, really get your thoughts related to that. Trying to think if there's any other items. And then we are going to do a special assignment the week of the Art as Advocacy lecture. So instead of the journal assignment, you guys will have an alternate assignment, which Kelsey will go into.
Yeah, so I can share my screen so y'all can see that. All right. You don't have to worry about this too much yet, but we want to put it on your radar just in case you want to start thinking about it. But like Alexis said, this won't be an additional assignment. This will just replace your reflection after our class on March 18th. So what we're going to ask you to do is to create an advocacy piece kind of based on what we learned during that class. And that could be, we put some examples here, like a TikTok, a short video, flyer, Instagram post, Facebook post, anything like that. For the purpose of spreading convincing factual information and to encourage individuals to receive the COVID-19 vaccine or to follow COVID-19 guidelines. So just asking you all to like think creatively of how do we spread this information in a way that will make people feel more comfortable and more encouraged to comply. And the purpose of the assignment is to promote creativity. So you'll just be graded on completion, not necessarily like the quality or tech savviness. So we don't want this to discourage anyone who maybe isn't that active on social media. There's lots of ways to do this assignment that don't require that. But we do want you to think creatively what is a way that this might affect people in whatever material you make. So all that's required is to write a sentence about the priority population that you selected. So I want you to think intentionally about who your material is targeted at and how it might influence them. So just a sentence on who you chose. And then to submit the final product that you created on an assignment discussion board that we'll have on Blackboard. And we just want you to submit the final product so that it's consistent, whether you're able to post it on social media or not. Doesn't affect the assignment. We just want to see what you created. But we do want you to let us know if you do post it and maybe what impact that had or anything like that. And then this assignment came up as a collaboration with Radical Public Health as a COVID-19 group. And then also the Collaboratory has been doing some work around distributing information. So it is optional to give us permission to share your creative product with RPH and the Collaboratory and the COVID-19 outreach team to share on their platforms. So that is a cool way for us to partner and to apply what we're learning in class. So, and it will be due on the 29th, which is the Monday after spring break. So if you have any questions, let us know. It's not super high pressure, just an opportunity to be a little creative and mix it up and not write another reflection for that week, hopefully.
Yeah.
Someone asked, can it be something they've already created? I would say you can use that as a basis, but we are looking for you to also apply things you've learned in this class as well. So think about that in mind. Like that can be like a basis. Maybe you made like a TikTok, for instance. You can make it like a series now, like a series of small TikToks. So you did a Snapchat story, you can kind of update it or add to it or something like that. But we do want you to kind of think about the assignment and what we've learned, talked about from like now into like the advocacy piece, because there are going to be things you learn or understand better or grow more within that scope. So we want you to apply those things too.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I think that's all of our housekeeping items. So now we have some time for discussion. Yeah, and if anyone has like questions, feel free to send us an email or something like that. All right. So is anyone excited to just like start talking? Or should I just start asking questions? Okay, so I saw a lot of folks posted on the discussion board this week. A lot of folks were like excited about how all the readings kind of work together. And even though not necessarily all the pieces were touched on in the lecture, I'm excited to kind of see like the course building on previous sessions from week to week. Like our speaker today talked about neoliberalism and the collective coming together, kind of more mutual aid from last week. So we see kind of like these themes from earlier in the semester being built on for future sessions. And we're going to keep seeing that throughout the rest of the semester as we go into more specifics about like movements and specific issues that we see. So stay brushed up on all of that. So one of the one of the questions that someone posted on the discussion board was how this housing crisis, or not crisis, relates to anti-vagrancy policies. And I think Amy shared an example of Mercer Island in Seattle, or a suburb of Seattle, that made sleeping in public places illegal. And I think we see this in like a lot of things like this in other cities. Like I'm pretty sure they do this in Chicago. Like they purposefully make benches uncomfortable, or put the dividers in the benches so people can't sleep on them. Yeah, anti-homeless structures in Chicago. So how do you all think that? How do you think of these anti-vagrancy policies as they relate to the overall housing policies and structures that our speaker talked about and we read about in the readings? Don't all speak at once.
I can actually kind of start. I actually remember in 2013 going to London. Oh, it says we can't unmute ourselves. Yeah, the students can't unmute
I
themselves.
fixed it. Thanks.
But I'll just I mean, someone said, could you put the question in the chat box? I'll just go really quickly. I've actually noticed a rise in a lot of anti-homeless, in what's also called violent architecture. And a lot of people don't initially think that they are going to impact other people. But for instance, in New York, in the subways, they've taken the benches off, and now people who are pregnant or disabled or just need to rest, now they can't rest. And in 2013, I did notice like spikes in front of stores. And at first I was like, I didn't understand what it was for. I was like, are these for pigeons? These are some big pigeons. And then I realized, no, it's so that people can't lay down and get any kind of residual warmth. And I think that that's, anti-homeless architecture has been rising with this kind of growing neoliberalism that, cuts social services, but also does not offer any alternative resources. So they're saying, on the one hand, we don't want to see homeless people here. They're an eyesore, right? To me, if there are homeless people in your neighborhood, they're your neighbors, one. But we don't want to see them, they're an eyesore, but we're not really offering them any kind of alternatives. So in a way, they're saying, I think we know what they're saying covertly, but overtly, these policies are just trying to push them and shrink them and disappear them.
I would say it reveals like that housing for all really isn't for all. It's a policy that is meant to, benefit people who are already in power and people who are the landlords and like our speaker was talking about, the big corporations who own properties. And again, it goes back to like the, who's deserving of housing. And, it's a clear violation of the idea that housing should be a human right if we're willing to spend money to prevent people from trying to, create a home or exist somewhere.
I think too, it also is a way of shifting the blame. Like everyone wants to look like the good person and no one really wants to take accountability. And so if the park benches have, handles, then the government can blame the parks district and the parks district can blame the designer and the designer can blame the funding. And there's just no one to like, I shouldn't say there's no one, but I think people pass along the blame and no one wants to be responsible for it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think we see that in Chicago, definitely.
Well, and also,
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
I was just going to say also the, the issue that Professor Soderberg was talking about in terms of, the policies in Berlin and Dublin, and which I think we see replicated lots of places in the US as well, that there's still, redistribution. It's just redistribution up, right, to privatize the public housing market rather than actually doing, redistributing down and giving people stability and access that they need in terms of their housing.
And I'm thinking even on top of that, even private shelters, the speaker spoke on this a little bit, how it's being shifted from public, like social housing programs to privatized ones. Chicago even consistently takes away funding from private shelters and private organizations that are trying to like help homeless people, trying to house homeless people. They consistently try to like shift their tax situation so that it's more difficult for those shelters to survive.
Yeah, it also made me think about here in Chicago when they tore down all of the housing projects on the south side. I think they tore some down on the west side as well. They pretty much just took down the whole from 55th all the way down to 22nd Street, all of those housing projects. Now, granted, they were public housing and they were not in the best of condition, but they displaced so many people. Um, and and then they never did anything with all of that land like the way they were supposed to. um so now you have all this land from this long strip, from 55th all the way down. I think they left like one of the places, but they renovated it, but everything else is gone. And they didn't do anything with it. When they tore down Michael Reese Hospital for the quote Olympic Village, when they tore down, all of these areas with all these hopes and dreams of what they were going to do to Chicago, and now it's just like, well, it didn't happen, so we just didn't do anything with it. And so I think one of the most prominent shelters over here is like the Pacific Garden over there on State Street. I think some of you guys probably have maybe heard of that, but it's that's the only one that I could think of. But then like some of the others are like in the south suburbs, like pads and things like that, or like these little smaller women shelters that do house women and children. Because there was one actually across the street from my old church, but I don't want to butcher your name, Shreyas, was saying that they take away, it's just these small places that they'll obtain like a regular apartment building and kind of convert it into a shelter. And the Olive Branch, that's one that's 63rd, so that's another one too. But they're constantly looking for donations and constantly looking for just the free help because they can't get any type of governmental or any city funding, and then they only have such a limited space because these places are usually really small. So that's what I was thinking about when with what she was talking about, this housing crisis, and even some of the public housing. Like I live in a subsidized building, and you would think because it's a HUD property that it would, it's federal, we get, a lot of things are kind of run by HUD, but it's like, ugh, it's terrible. Like they don't fix things the way they should. They don't do, all of it. They did offer a moratorium for rent, but that's about it. But if our elevators aren't working, we have to take the stairs, and I live on a 15th floor, so I have to do that. So yeah, and it's hard because our laundry room is in the basement, so if the elevators aren't running, can't do our laundry. So it's just so many things that it's just so sad. And I remember when they started putting up those benches that Alexa was talking about with those barriers and things, and it's like now you have these communities of tents on the expressways. I don't know. Alexis, I see you shaking your head. I mean, Ms. Grant, I'm sorry. About those little small villages of the homeless people here. They have like, but I don't think they have like those. I think in California they have like designated areas for people that don't have homes. So it's sad because now we have like 2 to 3 feet of snow here. It's like, where are those people at now?
It's funny you mentioned California, because I think it was in California, another city where people took it upon themselves to build, like tiny houses, and then police took them and then just dumped them. So even when the community comes up with and solutions, it's the problem isn't it's just the government isn't doing anything. They're doing things to actively harm, though, right? That's the kind of issue. Not a, oh, we're just kind of letting the chips fall where they may. They're actively participating in harm, or in the harm of others.
Yeah, so much we see our society criminalizes poverty and criminalizes homelessness and creates barriers to even get out of that.
Speaking to specifically Central California, most of those places in the Bay Area have policy set up so that it's like very heavy housing zoning to prevent any kind of like high density housing, to prevent anything other than just like a single very inefficient suburban look to those places. And that often leads to increases obviously in homelessness for those regions. And you pair that with increasing in policing for those neighborhoods, and homeless people have really nowhere to go except for into the prison system.
So I'm curious to hear from folks in light of what you've learned today and read this week. What does it mean for you? Does it impact your practice or work? If so, how?
Hi, everybody. So this week kind of hits home because I know what it's like to be homeless, because me and my family were homeless as a kid. And so I know what it's like to be in that situation, although you shouldn't have to be in that situation to have some empathy and compassion for someone in that situation. But I am a strong proponent of housing as a human right. It's being unhoused is a public health issue. There are so many things we could correct if we would just house people. And so my current degree program with the environmental occupational health sciences is industrial hygiene, but I'm really into science-informed policy, because this is something that needs to be fixed at a policy level. And so I really enjoyed the presentation today because it was evidence-based, research and data. So we can take that to policy level and see, this thing you keep telling us to do, that doesn't work. So we're not doing that anymore. That's not effective. So that has encouraged me, strengthened what I want to do as far as science-informed policy.
I guess for me, what kind of stuck out to me from the readings, and I kind of talked about this a little bit in my discussion boards, because I'm in maternal and child health. So when it came to the homeless women and children population, and they have the higher likelihood of becoming pregnant, that was the thing that really stuck out to me, is because I think, I don't know if it was this class when we read articles about contraceptive health for homeless women. It probably was my social work class, but it's so funny because this topic just came up when we either, I think last week or this week, and we just read an article about that, and they don't have the means to protect their contraceptions and protect their things and use those type of things because they don't have stable housing to keep appointments for the doctors to do their contraception regimen, or using survival sex to for them and their family just to have somewhere to sleep. So those things I think about when it comes to the maternal and child health population, because it's, you never know what someone's story is when they come in to receive services, and you should never, one can never assume that because they're there that everything's okay in their lifestyles. They may just be coming for one time, and that's how that'll impact me to have that bias free thinking when trying to help others, because of those types of situations that are unknown.
Would anyone else like to share?
For me, I think this has just been like a really good conversation to have, because I am like the position I'm in currently with my part-time job, which I think I talked about a couple of weeks ago as well. Um, I'm in an awkward position where I either have the opportunity to assist homeless clients in DuPage County and get them housed, or on the other hand, sometimes I have to decline clients due to funding requirements in terms of documentation and things like that. So, especially during the pandemic, I've seen how, the closure of government buildings and offices and things like that can truly create even more barriers that clients have to face in trying to get, social security cards and IDs. And it's also then a barrier because um, the grants that we use in order to fund our transitional housing and permanent supportive housing programs all require these like quote unquote basic documentation. And I find it very ironic that we're required to hound these clients to get these documents, like fully aware of the fact that many of them don't have these documents because many of them are chronically homeless. Like they've moved from place to place to place. And the other thing that I take issue with, um, especially within my job, is the way some of the grants define what homelessness is. Some of the grants only define, like they have a very narrow definition of you have to be either living in a uninhabitable situation, which is literally your car or outside, or be registered with a shelter, which that means that it cuts out and disqualifies so many people that are temporarily housed with family or friends that are actually homeless, but unfortunately don't fall under that specific definition. So then they don't get to be able to access a lot of these housing opportunities that do exist.
Yeah, that's a great point. Anyone else like to share?
That's a good point that she brought up about how we define homelessness, because we were unhoused, but we weren't necessarily on the street. We were kind of surviving with, whatever family member or friend or person who was just nice enough to let us, sleep on their couch for a couple days. So if you're defining homelessness in this very narrow way, there are many people who will get cut out of the services that they need. We need to broaden our understanding of what homelessness or housing insecurity, what that means and what it looks like for many people.
Yeah, I would also say there's actually correlatives with this and getting other social services. So people who are disabled, they sometimes narrow or expand, but generally narrow under neoliberalism, the requirements to be considered disabled while expanding the amount of paperwork and hoops you have to go through. So generally, you will need the assistance of someone who is not only able-bodied, but able-bodied in understanding within the system. So for instance, when we're talking about housing, I'm not going to get into it, but I had a friend who was, unhoused. He had come from a certain situation. And when he was helping somebody else, he made it his job to know the system and know if you have been in a shelter, this is what you do. If you're staying with family and friends, this is what you do. If you are out on the street because the shelters are full, this is what you do. This is how you document these things and these occurrences in your life. And these are the social services you go to. And when it comes to disability, a friend of mine, she's disabled and she was born disabled, and her son was also born disabled. So her mother, who is an immigrant, her mother was like, you're giving my daughter an education, right? But now for her, she knows the system. She knows what her son's entitled to. She knows when the deadlines are. She knows what to file. And so but that's also the problem. Like, had he just been disabled or like, you know, something happened and she had passed, he would know how to navigate that system because they keep making all these changes. Oh, well, because you charted high, you can't have ADHD, you can't be autistic, you can't be blind if you can see from this far to this far. You know, you can't have an audio processing disorder if you were able to do your homework. Those kinds of things that shift, you know, under neoliberalism, they kind of, like I said, they expand the amount of hoops you have to jump through, but then they also shrink or constrain these requirements, these kind of definitions for people.
Anyone else want to have the final word? Yeah, housing intersects with so many different areas of health and public health. Travis put in the chat that he works at inpatient mental health facility, and patients don't want to be discharged because they don't have anywhere to go. And then folks on the discussion board mentioned like LGBTQ populations, mothers with children, and we talked a little bit about refugees and immigrants. So there's a lot of intersectionalities related to homelessness. So it really is a complex problem, but not too complex to solve. All right, with that, I will dismiss you out into the world to enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Kelsey, you can hop off if you want. Or whatever, if you have something to do.
Or stay. Hi, Kelsey.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Oh, yeah.
We'll do that.